Mr. Reeder, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
It's my pleasure.
And let's start off with the question. Tell us your name and how long you've been affiliated with Moorhead area.
I'm J.D. Reeder, and I was born in Lexington, but I've lived in Moorhead all my life. Worked here, retired here, except for a brief period of a couple of years when I was away in graduate school. I've been a Moorheadian and content to be.
Now, you are very active in the local theater guild. And of course, you are a radio host. You have a slew of historical things you do with the county. You've extensively studied and wrote performance pieces on figures from Moorhead's past. What got you interested in doing such pieces as you have?
I've been interested in local history all my life, and since I'm not a professionally, academically trained historian, the best way for me to express that interest is in writing creative pieces, stories and dramas. Enjoy it very much, and there's a great interest here in local history as well. These have all been well received. Hope to continue that.
So, if you had to explain the Rowan County War to someone who's not from this area, who's never heard the history before, how would you explain what the Rowan County War was?
That's a very complicated question, but I'll try to give you a succinct answer. The Rowan County War was a feud, much in the tradition of other mountain feuds for which Eastern Kentucky became nationally and internationally infamous in the late 1800s. It began in a climate of political conflict and unrest, and like so many of these events, there was a catalyst. An argument erupted on the grounds of the courthouse on election day when there was a large crowd gathered on a hot day. There was alcohol involved. There were numerous guns being carried in that era. Nearly everybody had a gun. And a fellow took a swing at another fellow, and pretty soon the fight began to spread, and before long it was a riot. One man killed another, and in the sorting out of who was responsible for what, battle lines were drawn, families took sides, and the conflict was on. It lasted for just under 3 years. 20 people were killed, almost that many were wounded. The local economy was wrecked. It had a far-reaching effect on things in Moorhead. Thankfully, though, it did come to an end, and feuding in general came to an end with the beginning of the 20th century.
What made you want to write a piece on the Rowan County?
It's such an important story for the local area. It's arguably the most influential, most significant event in this county's history since 1856. Many attempts have been made to write about it. Some are reasonably accurate. Some are outrageously inaccurate. None have really told the entire story, going all the way back and tracing the climate which gave rise to the feud, or doing the follow-up to show the long-term effects on what the feud brought to this area. I wanted to try to tie up a lot of those loose ends, and to do it in the form of a drama rather than a straight history.
It was very well received. You had sellouts, I believe, every night.
We did. We performed 6 times, and this auditorium was full for all the performances. I was asked when we began, and it was a facetious question, you think you might upset anybody by writing about the feud? Because there was a time when I was a child when it wasn't often openly talked about, because there were still people whose parents and grandparents had active memories of it. I said, no, I don't think so, because too much time has passed. I believe the only people that we really upset were the ones who couldn't get in because we were simply full and couldn't squeeze anybody else through the door.
Now let's start off here with Frank Button. Of course, Frank Button came here with his mother Phoebe, normal school, but you have done a lot of research on Frank Button, even played him in Convocation performance. But as you have researched Frank Button, and wrote about Frank Button. Who was Frank Button, and how did he get to Morehead?
Well, Frank Button was a young man from Illinois originally. He did have Kentucky roots, especially on his father's side of the family. He was orphaned. His father died when he was very young, and he was brought up by his mother, who was a devout, dedicated Christian lady. She was active in her church, a teacher. And under her influence, Frank became a teacher as well. He also had a call to the ministry. He combined these two professions, teacher and young preacher. The Buttons' mother and son came to Morehead in the fall of 1887, just after the feud had ended in a dramatic shootout battle at the end of June in that same year. The missions arm of the Christian church decided that Morehead would be an ideal place to establish a school that would bring Christian education to the Morehead area. And the Buttons were sent here to begin that effort. He reported that on his first day in town, as he traveled about meeting some of the local folks and beginning to establish a presence here, that there were still occasionally stray shots fired in the area of the railroad tracks. And once or twice that day, he had to duck for cover behind a barrel or around the corner of a building.
What research did you do to try to play Frank in these performances?
I relied fairly heavily on the history of Morehead State University that Don Flatt did some years ago, as well as some of the other local historical writing produced by Dr. Jack Ellis. Other than that, I've had the good fortune earlier in my life to have talked to some people who actually knew Frank Button, who attended churches that he pastored, who talked with him, who were baptized by him in local streams. And from all of that, I began to put together an idea of the kind of person that he was.
Was Frank more of an academic or a man of the cloth?
I think first, foremost, and always, Frank Button was a man who felt that he had a calling to preach and to teach and to advance the gospel of Christ in the world. That is not to say that his academic pursuits were entirely secondary to that. I think he sought to combine them. But I think his first love always was something that would satisfy his urge as a pastor and a Christian educator. I am told that the title of address and respect that he favored most was simply Brother Button.
Yeah, Jack Ellis told me once that Frank Button was more proud of the church, founding the church.
I think so. I think he considered that his greatest accomplishment. It's interesting that when he passed away, his funeral was not in the auditorium that now bears his name. It was in the church that he helped to establish and pastored on more than one occasion.
So Frank was brought back in as the first president of the state school. Was this something that he excelled at?
I think Frank Button was a very competent educator and administrator. That occurred as he was getting older, when he came back to Morehead as the first president of Morehead State Normal School and Teachers College, as it was known back then. He was entering his 60s, and in the 1920s, that meant that a person was looking pretty much in the last chapters of his life. He was an able man. I think perhaps there were some who considered that he wasn't as aggressive as he might have been in helping the new institution get its legs under it. But I think overall he did well. He was certainly a person that everyone respected, and in a new venture of that kind, that's an important element.
Did Frank Button receive the respect that he deserved in his lifetime, that now this grand role in this formation of this university here in Morehead?
I think Button was held in great esteem, especially by the people whose lives he had touched personally over a long number of years in his work in education and in his church work. There were probably some times when there were points of tension with university government through its Board of Regents when they felt that perhaps it was time for him to seek a well-earned retirement.
Now let's switch to talking about Allie Young. Again, you and I talked on the phone about the destruction of the Allie Young Law Office, which I still don't understand. But I guess all in the name of progress. But who was Allie Young?
Allie Young was a lawyer who grew up in Moorhead. He was actually born at Elizaville in Fleming County in 1865. When he was about 7 years old, his family moved from Fleming County to Moorhead, where his father set up a law practice. Allie Young grew up in a lawyer's office. He and his two brothers, William Young and Taylor Young Jr., were all lawyers. In those days, a person did not have to go to law school. You studied typically with somebody who was already a lawyer, and when your mentor felt that you knew enough, you would appear before a panel of examiners, and if they certified your knowledge of the law was sufficient to the local circuit judge, you would receive your law license. And that's just what happened to him. Allie Young was licensed to practice law just about the time he was 18 years old. And by the time he was 20, he was the county attorney here. He became very much interested in politics on the local level and on the state level. He was a skillful politician as well as being a very competent lawyer and a respected judge. Allie Young never lost an election. He came at a point in his life to enjoy the game of politics and the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that politics involves more than he enjoyed the practice of law, but he was very adroit at both.
Now, what role did Allie Young play in bringing the state school to Moorhead?
When the decision was made to locate a new state normal school somewhere in northeastern Kentucky, the original idea would be that it would be established somewhere in the Big Sandy Valley. And so the principal cities in that part of the state all put in their bids to have the school located there. Through Allie Young's urging, Moorhead also made an offer. After all, the old Moorhead Normal School campus was here. Its buildings were here. It had closed operation shortly before. He felt it was a perfect fit, and he wanted Moorhead to have the school because of the advantages that it would bring to the community in so many ways. He worked very hard to make that happen. It's not inaccurate to say that he used his influence with members of the commission that would make the decision, and as to the final recommendation where the new school would be, it's accurate to say that without Allie Young's urging, it wouldn't have happened. The school would have gone to Paintsville instead.
It would be a very much different landscape. I once read that Allie Young was the man behind the curtain, so to speak, when it came to a lot of these things on campus. What was the relationship like between Allie Young and Frank Button in those early days?
I compare it basically to two alpha males stalking each other. Allie Young was a person who did not feel he had to hold high political office himself in order to be a person of influence and consequence in state government. The highest office he ever held was that of state senator. There was talk many times of his running for governor. He probably felt, with the controversy attached to his family going back to the feud days, that that might not be the best course for him to follow. So he fulfilled the role of a kingmaker, a deal broker, someone who worked very effectively behind the scenes. At that time, a governor was in office for only one term and could not succeed himself. Allie Young felt that as an influential state senator influencing public policy from behind the curtain, if you will, he could be a force to be reckoned with for much longer than the typical four-year governor's term. Once the school was established and Frank Button was brought back to be its first president, Allie Young remained on the Board of Regents for the rest of his life. And he felt, I'm sure, that his ideas deserved a hearing. He expected to have an influence and to be listened to. And there were times, certainly, when his vision for the new school and Frank Button's vision might not have lined up 100%. So there was bound to be some tension there. But for the most part, I think it was a creative tension that led to good results.
Yeah. How did Allie Young die?
Allie Young's death was a true tragedy. He was not quite 70 years old. He had heart and kidney problems, and when he developed a very serious ear infection in 1935, in the absence of the good medications that we have now, his death resulted from complications from mastoiditis.
Now, Allie Young, of course, fathered a child late in life, but still alive.
Yes. When Allie Young was about 62 years old, his youngest child was born, a daughter, Jane Young Holbrook, who is still living. That's a remarkable thing for anybody to be able to say, that they're the child of a man who was born 150 years ago this year.
It's really cool. And then, of course, in Button Auditorium, Allie Young and Frank face each other.
Yes, they do. That's a wonderful reminder of what the situation was like here in the 1920s and up to about 1930, when these two men were the two most important presences, if you will, on the campus, and that's still the case. Young on one side and Button on the other, and it was that way then, and we have that little hint of what that must have been like.
No, after Button, or after Allie Young's death, his wife filled his term as the Board of Regents.
That's true. Mrs. Young held a seat on the Board of Regents until her death in the early 1950s.
Well, switching gears a little bit, moving forward in time, why did the university or state college in those days seem to struggle in so many different ways until Adrian Dorr?
It was a challenging era for many reasons. After Button retired, the country moved into the Great Depression. And on the heels of that, of course, was the Second World War. There were political struggles. The institution is governed by a Board of Regents, and governors are supposed to stay out of the day-to-day operations of those boards of regents. But sometimes the governors that we had back then found it difficult to do that. We also had a series of presidents who found various challenges to their leadership. They struggled with their boards. They struggled with state government. They struggled with appropriations in a financially difficult and challenging time. They struggled with a disastrous drop in enrollment among men during wartime. There was just so many factors that combined to make the operation of this school a huge, huge challenge and fraught with difficulties. All of that came to a head in the late 1940s when, because of political interference in the operation of the school's Board of Regents, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools sanctioned the institution and withdrew accreditation, which in the view of a great many people made degrees from Morehead State worthless. Happily, that situation was resolved after a couple of years. Accreditation was restored. And then in the early 50s, Adrian Doran came on the scene. A man of very interesting credentials and qualifications. He had a long history of school administration in Western Kentucky, his native area. He also had experience in the state legislature. He knew, like Allie Young knew, who to talk to and how to get things done in Frankfort. And he was, without question, the right man in the right place at the right time for Morehead State University's rebuilding in the 1950s.
You know, you can't really walk anywhere on the campus today without seeing something Adrian Dorn had some sort of role in creating, whether it's a building or campus layout. I I personally think it would be difficult, especially his predecessors. First, really, wasn't until Ron Eaglin that there was a steady president on campus post-Adrian Doran's years.
Yeah, I think it's often the case when a gigantic presence like he was, who is in place for so long as he was, over 20 years, finally retires. It's difficult to fill that vacuum, and we certainly saw that happen here. We are, I think, in a good place now. Dr. Doran's influence is unquestionable. There's evidence of that all over the place to this very day. Not only in the buildings that he built, but in the whole attitude toward this institution becoming more than just a teacher's college that would serve a collection of counties in eastern Kentucky. His vision was that the school had a mission that was much more comprehensive than that.
Backing up a little bit, are you familiar with President Baird and sort of his sort of tragic years as president?
William Jesse Baird was a fine man, I think a great deal like Frank Button in so many ways. One of my old professors at Moorhead, Wilhelm Exelbert in the history department, was employed here in 1948, as he put it, after an interview with the sainted Dr. Baird. He revered this man very much, and so did other people. He was ill. He had a very serious heart condition which hampered his physical vigor, but he was a fine, fine man. It's a great shame that he was not in better health and could have continued longer.
And he remains the only president who died in office.
That's right.
What is the one aspect of the old Moorhead campus that you miss from being a kid?
Yeah.
Growing up in this area?
Well, I used to come up here long before I was a student here. It was just a place that you visited often. I miss part of the old landscape. Of course, inevitably trees die, they get damaged in storms, they come down. That's just what happens. I miss a bit of the intimacy of the old campus, but you can't remain a place with 2,000 students forever. You've got to grow and you have to move on. There was a real charm about the school's look physically. And as we've gotten bigger, we've tried to remain attractive. It still is regarded as one of the most beautiful campuses that people come to see. And another part of its effectiveness, I think, has to do with the close relationship of faculty and students. That's been maintained over the years, even though the school has grown. It's easy to be nostalgic, and I like to do that occasionally, but I look forward to what Moorhead is constantly becoming as well.
Yeah, one of the things in working with the special collections is they recently purchased the original draft of the Olmsted Brothers drawings for the original campus. Because they want to try to return back to the crescent moon shape and make it a walking campus.
Right.
Which I think is really cool.
That's a very exciting idea. Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people will be upset somehow or another. But JD, what has the university here meant to the people of Eastern Kentucky and around the campus?
The presence of this school in this place, from its beginnings as a private Christian school in the 1880s to what it has become now, over 125 years later, has been absolutely incalculable to the cultural life and the economic life of this area. Thousands upon thousands of people who might otherwise have never been able to seek and complete higher education have been able to do that because Moorhead State has been here. It has immeasurably enriched the quality of life in this area. I don't think that we would have so many of the other advantages that we now have had it not been for the location of Moorhead State here. Without it, we would be just another little sleepy county seat town off the beaten path. One could argue perhaps that without it, we wouldn't even have part of the infrastructure that we now have. I think I-64 would still travel the path that it does, but there wouldn't be a major 4-lane connector to it probably, were it not for Morehead State and other local institutions such as the medical center and other industries.
What is one thing you can say about our town and university here in Morehead that would be a great sort of line you can take out of people who see this interview? A line about our town and our university and our community.
So many people have told me who came to Morehead to work years ago, feeling they might stay a year or two until they got themselves established as an academic and then move on. And many of those people are still here after 40 years or 50 years or even longer because they found Morehead a good place to live and work, a good place to rear children. And I think, as one friend from some years ago, Dr. Shirley Gish, who taught speech, said, the town is just a little town in northeastern Kentucky, but the unique combination of personalities and local resources, among which you find Morehead State University sort of at the center, makes it an incredibly good place to be. And I think that's what I would say. It's a good place to live, it's a good place to work, it's a good place for children as well.
And then kind of off the question list here, you wrote the play on the Youngs. And how was the turnout for that?
It was very good. We did it 2 weekends. The first weekend we were practically full. We had about 30 members of the Young family who were here. Mrs. Holbrook and her family. And then another descendant of Allie Young's father was here with a dozen people from his part of the family from southern Indiana. The second weekend we were up against some other events that were going on in the community, but it was still a very good turnout, and it was very well received. People always like these things because they're interested in the local history.
Yeah, I've always noticed that the local Morehead folks really enjoy the history.
Yeah, I have other things on the drawing board. I want to try to do one new one each year as long as I can, so that we still have a sense of who we came from, which helps us to understand where we're going.
No, if I could give you an idea here, interviewing folks and then digging through documents and photographs, I think an interesting topic would be Ed Maggard.
Oh, absolutely.
That would be a fantastic topic.
Ed Maggard was Morehead's Leonardo da Vinci. He was an absolute, authentic genius.
Well, to talk about it, who was Ed Maggard?
Ed Maggard was a fellow who came to Morehead around the turn of the 20th century, primarily to help get utilities started here. He established the first electrical utility service in Morehead. And tragically, his son, Earl, died in an electrocution accident related to the operation of that. He was a builder, he was an entrepreneur, he was an engineer. He built the old Trail Theater movie house in the 1930s and designed an air conditioning system for it. It was the only building in the summer that was pleasantly cool inside, and he came up with the idea for that. Earlier, in the teens, during the time just before World War I, he developed and patented and established a manufacturing plant for an improved movie projector, the Cosmograph, that took the flicker out and made it much more enjoyable to watch movies. He couldn't compete with the big manufacturing giants, and his little company was absorbed. But he just had a tremendous ability to see a problem, diagnose a solution, and then make it happen. And you're right, he would be an excellent subject for a Back in Time episode.
Yeah. Was he a filmmaker? filmmaker as well?
I think he did. There's another funny story about him. He drove the first car in Moorhead. There was a local businessman, wealthy fellow named Sam Bradley, who wanted a car. And he and Ed Maggard went out of town to buy one. They went on the train, and the plan was, we'll go wherever we're going to go and buy the thing, and we'll drive it back to Moorhead. Neither of them had ever driven a car before. But Ed Maggard figured it out in about 3 minutes on the road, and thank goodness there weren't very many other cars on the road, so the possibility of an accident was minimized. But that was just the kind of person he was. He was rarely backed off by any sort of challenge, especially if it had to do with mechanics, the way something worked.
I've even heard Steve Young told me once that there's a legend that he created a film to show how great this town is.
Wouldn't that be something to have these days? My goodness.
I know Steve Young told me they found a canister of film.
Mm-hmm.
They sent it out to the UCLA film line.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I don't know what was on. I don't know if he shot the film
Huh.
or something. He just projected. I was frothing at the mouth.
Oh, sure.
An old 1921
Right.
version of Moorhead.
Right. Oh, what a...
Kind of off the questions now, but the train played a huge role in this town. And it's one of the things that a lot of historians in the area like to talk about the train line, the role the train had here in town. It's one of the things that I kind of miss when I read the histories.
Yeah.
I try to think about the train, students coming off the train.
Yes. No question about it. Until the railroad was completed through here in 1881, Moorhead really was a sleepy little off the beaten track kind of place. But with the coming of the railroad, the population more than doubled within 5 or 6 years. New businesses literally popped up out of the ground from day to day. It was a tremendous boost to the economy. Coming right on the heels of that, of course, was the feud time in the later 1880s, and that was a major setback. But the presence of the railroad helped to boost the economy after that troublesome time was over, because most everything of consequence came in and left here by rail until highways were improved and trucking had advanced, until the railroad was sort of eclipsed by all of that. But in my childhood, I remember how fondly people used to go to the train station to watch the trains come and go, and to meet the trains just to see who was arriving and who was leaving. It was a conduit for news. And it was also the means by which high school students were reminded of their curfew. The last passenger train that came through Moorhead in the evening, sometime around 10 o'clock. Their instructions generally were, when that train comes through town, it's time for you to be home.
Do you miss hearing the train?
Oh, I do. I miss it. I used to love to travel by train. It was nothing like it.
It's one of the interesting things about Northeast Kentucky. Until you really hit Ashland and the Polk counties, you don't have a train presence.
Right. Right.
Well, I think that'll do us for today.
Okay,
We
good.
covered a lot of stuff there. Of course, there's still more stuff we could talk about. But
Yeah.
do you think that Allie Young's daughter would be open for an interview like this?
I don't know.
Is her health?
Jane is 88 years old. She's still in very good health. She doesn't live in Moorhead anymore. She lives in the Somerset area at a resort community down there called Bronston, I think. I don't know how she would feel about that. Her family, when we talked to them about the drama, they said, well, we'll talk to her about it. She's always a little concerned when her father and his father and her uncles are the subject of something, just how that's going to be handled. And she was assured that although we would be objective and certainly not paint him as an angel, that we would be fair. And we were, and she really enjoyed what we did. They liked the fact that there's some controversy connected with him, that he was a person who made headlines, that he was a person that the state Democratic establishment at the time didn't like very much. They were all Democrats, but they thought he was kind of an upstart. I mean, who was Allie Young to compare with these establishment types in Louisville and Frankfort and Lexington? From this little place in eastern Kentucky, who does he think he is? Well, he was smarter than most of the rest of them. That's who he was. And they like to be reminded that he has that history. I'm not sure how she would feel about an interview, though.
Yeah. Well, rightfully so. I'd be nervous too, probably.
Yeah.
But for oral history's sake and just a record.
Yes, I have, and I still think this would be a worthwhile thing to do. In a future Back in Time segment, I'd like to focus on Allie Young himself for about a half an hour in a Chautauqua-like presentation. I have an awful lot of the factual background, but what I would like to have is more of a look at Allie Young as a person, what his demeanor was like, how he related to people. Was he frosty and aloof and formal, or was he folksy and accessible and open and come on up and sit down and let's talk kind of guy? And even though she was only 8 years old when he died, she does have those kinds of memories of him. And I need to talk with her more about that, because the people who have those memories are almost all gone now.
For documentation's sake.
Yeah.
I can find very few photographs of it, other than the standard one you always see.
The one on which the portrait in Button Auditorium is based. There's just a few. I've seen one. It accompanied one of Jack's columns in the local paper. He's sitting at his big roll-top desk in the office. Wonderful picture. He's got his elbow on the desk and he's leaned out, big smile. I've seen probably not more than a half dozen other photographs, including one of him as a young man when he sported a mustache, as most people did back then, and I was a little round. After we did Bloody Rowan, the feud play, William Young IV, who would be Allie Young's great-nephew, came to see it with several family members, and afterward he said, I have a collection, an archive of family materials, and I'm looking for a place to deposit it. And I want to be assured that if I do that, if people who are interested in researching this will have access to it. And after some discussion, he made this gift to the local library, public library, for its local history collection. And when he and his sister brought this big box, I was there and we went through it. And in the box there was a photograph about so big. Big old 2-story building with a bunch of people standing on the porch, top and balcony, or bottom and balcony level. I said, you know anything about this? He said, I don't have a clue. I have no idea. Anything written on the back? And he said, yeah, I think so. It's in pencil and it's very faint. It looks to me like it says, just all I can read is Christmas. Well, I looked at it, and after a couple of minutes, things began to take shape. It's Allie Young at about the age of 19 or 20. Standing on the porch with his father, his mother, and his 2 brothers. The building is the old Central Hotel that was diagonally across the street from this building, over there where the old Dixie Grill was, across from the Fuzzy Duck building. fellow named George Nickel built that building about 1881, 82, at the time the railroad came through. There was a need for more hotels in town immediately. He sold the building to Allie Young's father in about 1883 or 4. The Youngs lived there and then operated the rest of it as a hotel. Mr. Nickel retained jurisdiction over the pool room part of the building that was on the left end of the first floor. So there they stand. I said to Mr. Young, I said, I know who these people are. He said, well, you know more than I do. Who are they? I said, well, the big fellow with the hat and the big droopy mustache is your great-grandfather. That's Taylor Young. And the one over to the right, standing by himself by the post at the corner, is Allie. The woman next to Taylor is your great-grandmother, Amelia. And the young fellow with his hat kind of cocked back on his head is Bill Young, your grandfather. And the other fellow is his brother, Taylor Jr. I said, this is the only photograph of the Central Hotel I've ever seen. And it may be the only one that exists. He said, how do you know it's the Central Hotel? I said, well, during the feud, when all of this publicity was all over the country, newspapers from out of town would send artists into places like this with their sketch pads. And some of the coverage in the New York Times and the Courier-Journal shows drawings of local buildings. And there's one of those that is identified as Central Hotel, and it is unquestionably this building. And that man with that family group there is unquestionably Taylor Young, so it has to be. He said, now that I've given this away, I said, I will be glad to take this to a local place and have as many copies of this photograph made for you as you want. And he said, I'd like to have one. And he said, would it be okay to do a couple of more for my sisters? I said, absolutely. I'll have those in the mail to you in a couple of days. Well, he came back to see what we did with the Youngs last fall and had a good time. And what he had to say was very gratifying. He said, I am learning so much about my family that I didn't know before. And the other comment that was made that came from Jane Young Holbrook's daughter was, she said, everything that I have read about Allie and his brother Will and their father Taylor Young has been confirmed and accurately depicted and augmented by what has been done here. And that made me feel very good.
Yeah. Again, I'm going to try to get you a copy. DVD of the old film stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We're heading in the early 50s.
Yeah.
And I can't guarantee it, but I think there's film of William Jesse Winger.
Oh,
It's a faculty procession into a graduation.
Uh-huh.
And he's one of the last men. He had interesting hair.
White hair.
White hair.
Yeah.
And I'll have to get that to you and let you look through that. Maybe
Yeah.
who all those folks are. And of course, I've scanned everything in the Button collection they have except his journal. I'm going to scan it all and let you.
That would be a wonderful thing to read.
It was a lot of Bible verses.
Oh, yeah.
It was constant reminders of his faith.
Right. Well, at his grave in the Lee Cemetery on the east end of campus, you go in there and if you walk through the gate and you get to the first side road to the right, if you stand there, and if looking straight ahead puts you at 12 o'clock, if you pivot so that you're looking at 2 o'clock, there's a 7-foot high marble cross that you'll see. And that marks the plot where the Button family is buried. And at his grave, there's a marble stone that's so by so. Very simple, his name and the 2 dates and a Bible verse, of course. And I have a feeling that he probably picked it himself. And this is life eternal, to know God. It's a quotation from the Gospel of John. He died of complications after prostate surgery in 1933, I think. That was a couple of years before Allie Young. Young was a couple of years younger, and they died at almost exactly the same age. Yeah.
Poetic.
Isn't it though?
Or not, maybe more like two goats butting heads.
Exactly. Young had a very healthy ego. I think much more so than Button did. Everybody likes to be appreciated. Everybody likes to be credited for the things that they've done. Some people pursue that very aggressively. And Allie Young was that kind of person. Frank Button was not. You know, if credit comes, that's fine. His wife was far more personally disappointed in how that all turned out, I think, than he was. I think he was a little stung, but he had a good perspective on it. His wife felt that he had probably been treated pretty unfairly.
Yeah, I've heard that. Jack Ellis said that.
Yeah.
She felt he didn't get any of the recognition he
Right.
deserved.
And Jane has a good take on it. She said, well, I think they were both people of ability whose work supplemented each other's, and they were, whether they were always totally congenial about it, they were a good team because each had advantages that the other couldn't muster. I can't begin to imagine Frank Button being politically aggressive enough to do what needed to be done to get people's minds changed about putting that school in Moorhead. I can see Adrian Doran doing that because that was the political environment out of which he came. And in his time here, that is where the lion's share of the money to operate on came from. It was state appropriations. It's a whole other world now where college and university presidents have to be seekers of funding in ways that people in Doran's time wouldn't have imagined. Different skills for a new generation.
Oh yeah, go back to the normal school days, operating out of houses, whatever they could find. Yeah, the first day they were in a little house that stood about where Aduck is, and there was one kid, one little girl, Anna Page, who showed up. And the next day she brought somebody else. And within a month, they had a little room full. And from that, we have this today. I found Anna Page is sometimes referred to as an orphan, which for a lot of folks that means neither parent living. But in the 19th century, if a child's father was dead, they were often referred to as being an orphaned child. Anna's father is buried in the old section at the Lee Cemetery as well. Little humble marker. John Page, he was a carpenter. And I don't know if he died in a work-related accident or he had TB or whatever. But that's a little teeny bit of that story. What did she ever become?
Let's see. She lived to a good long life and was, I think, I'm a little sketchy about this. Don Flatt possibly covered this in his book. And there was some university event a few years ago where she was mentioned. I think her life eventually took her quite a distance away from here. And this is probably not 100% reliable, but I'm thinking she ended up in California. Maybe not. It was a good life, and she, like so many other people, continued to have very good feelings about their time in Moorhead and what the experience of being schooled here meant to her. Arguably, one of the most distinguished alumni of the old Moorhead Normal School was Dr. Harlan Hatcher, who was for many years the president of the University of Michigan. An alumnus of Moorhead Normal School back in the early days.
Did he ever come back?
He did. I think he did a time or two. He was scheduled to come back for an event much, much later and had planned to, but for some reason, maybe illness, he wasn't able to make the trip.
That's it, I didn't know that.
Yeah. I think that's in Dr. Flatt's book.
Well, Mr. Reader, I think Tanner has a class.